Okay, our speaker this afternoon is Tom Turner. He is, get his biography out here, our 2015 inductee to the Flight Instructor Hall of Fame. He was the 2010 National FAA Safety Team Representative of the Year, as well as the 2008 FAA Central Region CFI of the Year. He is a 3-time Master CFI. He also holds an ATP certificate with Instructor CFI and Multi-Engine Ratings and a Master's degree in Aviation Safety. He is the lead instructor for the Bonanza Pilot Training Program at the Beechcraft Factory. He also publishes a weekly newsletter called Flying Lessons Weekly, and he'll talk about that, but I can attest that it is an excellent presentation. He has over 4,300 hours logged, more than 2,600 as an instructor. Tom writes, lectures, and instructs extensively from his home in the air capital of aviation, Wichita, Kansas. Tom, thank you so much. Here's a certificate of appreciation from us, the FAA Safety Team.
Thank you very much, Sam.
The floor is yours.
Thanks. All right, I know some of you. Again, I'm Tom Turner. I'm from Wichita, Kansas, and I am Executive Director of the American Bonanza Society's Air Safety Foundation. I'm here through the generosity of the American Bonanza Society and our board, who encourages me to do these sorts of things. So if you are if you're a member of the American Bonanza Society, thank you. If you're at all interested in Beechcraft airplanes, drop on by our tent. We're across the street from Theater in the Woods. We have free soft drinks, popcorn. We've had a seminar series all week, but that's wrapping up. This is the last of the seminar series for us this year. But that's what I do that allows me to do some of these other things as well. This is the American Bonanza Society's 50th year of operation, so it's a big year for us. For those of you who are members, thank you for your support. I think I've got, see if I can turn this thing down here. Okay, I also do, as Sam said, I also do a thing called Flying Lessons Weekly. It's a weekly blog, I suppose is the right word for it. But what I try to do with Flying Lessons is look at some of the recent accidents that people are talking about, people are chatting about online. We don't know yet what actually caused that mishap, but what we can do is use those mishaps as a jumping off point to discuss things that might have happened, things that we can apply to our flying so that we can avoid getting into situations that might have been a factor in that mishap. It's at masteryflighttraining.com with hyphens in there. You can subscribe free if you want to do that. I welcome you, and I know several of you in here are readers as well. But that's what I do. I've actually done this longer than I've been at the American Bonanza Society. All right, so we're going to start today with a program we call Stop Talking About Safety, which is a controversial title, especially in this room, but you'll see that I have a point. Who out there feels that you are a safe pilot? Raise your hand if you're a safe pilot. All right, if you have not, we need to talk. But everybody, pretty much everybody thinks they are a safe pilot. Where it gets tricky is asking, what does it mean? What does it mean to be a safe pilot? Anybody, what's it mean to be a safe pilot? Not having an accident. All right, that is the main public definition of being safe in an airplane. Anytime you see a television report of a tragic aviation mishap, what do you almost always hear? A family member, a neighbor, a friend, what do they say? But he was such a safe pilot. And they say that because up to that point they didn't have any accidents. They haven't had any accidents. The reality is this person who makes that statement really doesn't have the information necessary to be able to say it. And of course we grieve for the person and their passengers, and it is very, very tragic. But the problem is that among the public and even among ourselves as pilots, we often think of being safe as being equal to I've not had an accident. At least not yet. I think that we can raise that bar significantly so that instead of saying I haven't had an accident, we can with a great deal of certainty say I am not going to have an accident. To do that, we need to really stop about talking about the term specifically safety, because safety again is equated in most people's minds to accident, not having an accident. When you talk about safety to most folks, it presents actually a negative portrayal of the real record. Who here looks at FAA safety or FAA.gov every week or maybe even every day and look at the list of preliminary accident reports. Does anyone besides me do that? Okay? All right. So what do you see? Monday morning, what are you going to see? How many accident reports are you going to see on a typical Monday morning? 25, 30, in this time of year, 34. It's not unusual at all to see what looks like a big string of accidents, and it is. Do not get me wrong. The whole purpose of this talk is to try to get that number down. What we don't see, however, is how many tens of thousands of successful takeoffs and landings occurred. Now, were those pilots safe? We don't know. They just didn't have an accident. When we talk about safety, however, in the context of accidents, especially when you talk to your family members or you talk to the public, all they think about are accidents. They don't think about the positives, they think about the negatives. So talking about safety can, in some terms, provide a negative portrayal of our industry and our actual record. The term safety to a lot of people tells them what they cannot do. I was an OSHA safety director for a construction company for a few years. A little bit of a diversion in my career. Now, admittedly, I was flying a couple of Beech Barons at the time, so I was kind of doing the airplane thing. But I did that, and I was the safety guy. And what happens when the safety guy comes? Well, everybody stops doing things the way they normally do them, and they do them the way that you think they want you to do them. And then as soon as you leave, what happens? They go back to the way they normally do things. The safety person is there to tell them, in their opinion, the safety person is there to tell them what not to do. Guess what? Pilots don't like to be told what they cannot do in their airplane. I prefer to tell them what they can do. There are boundaries, but these are the things you can do in your aircraft. And when we use the word safety, a lot of people automatically turn that off because they think, well, you're going to tell me that I can't use my airplane to do this, this, and this. Well, maybe those things they're doing are beyond the limitations of the aircraft, and you need to convince them otherwise, but you don't need to tell them because they just won't listen. They already think they're being safe because they haven't had a wreck. Along the same lines, the term safety sometimes portrays a limitation that the pilot or the owner doesn't think exists on their airplane. It's a negative. So all of this is getting to the point that the use of being the safety guy is not usually the good guy where pilots are concerned. We like to think we're all safe. We do think we're safe. But when someone starts to try to educate you towards safety, a lot of people kind of turn off that message. Besides, as I said, everybody thinks they're already a safe pilot. Instead of safety, I like to think in terms of two positive things that we can attempt to achieve in our airplanes. The first is mastery. Now, I chose that term for my company, Mastery Flight Training, for a reason. In the past, there was a statement in the then practical test standards that said that one of the completion standards for all maneuvers and all tasks was that the pilot demonstrate mastery of the aircraft, and that the successful outcome of the maneuver was never seriously in doubt. But I like that term mastery because that tells you something you can aim for. You can meet the minimum standards, but you want to try to aim for something more. Now that bleeds over a little bit, so I'll read it here. This is a dictionary definition of the word mastery. More than proficiency, mastery is, quote, comprehensive knowledge and display of great skill in a subject or accomplishment. Man, I want that to be the way people think about me when they think about me as a pilot. And it's when I look at that, that tells me I'm never quite there. I've got to keep working on trying to get even better to develop mastery in my airplane. The second term I'd like to talk about today is command. Who here has military experience? All right? Command is one of the hardest things to teach people, and in the military, they send you to academies to try to learn how to command. But there's a really good definition of command. This is right out of Webster.com. I didn't amend it or change it or anything at all. The first definition was to exercise direct authority or to dominate as if from an elevated place. Now, there's an airplane definition. Who here's a flight instructor? All right, you send a student to a practical test, and they fly the practical test maneuvers, and the examiner comes back to you afterwards, and they say, okay, your guy passed. All right, cool, everybody's great. But if they came back and said, man, your kid, That pilot commands the airplane and dominates the environment as if from an elevated place. Man, that tells you this person is good. And that's what I try to strive for myself, and that's what I think we need to try to strive for ourselves throughout the community. All right, so let's talk a little bit about mastery and command. Mastery involves retaining and constantly improving your skills. I'm going to give you some examples of ways we can do this here in just a little bit. But it doesn't mean saying, okay, I passed my check ride, I got through all of these maneuvers and tasks, and now I have this piece of plastic that says I can fly an airplane. It means, all right, I got through that check ride. What am I going to do to make sure that I stay at least that good all of the time and work to even get better? So mastery involves retaining work to and practice to retain and even improve your flying skills. Proficiency is only the first step. 3 takeoffs and landings in the last 90 days tells us we're proficient and we're current for carrying passengers in an airplane under whatever iteration of the circumstances we're talking about. But that's just the first step. Let's say you did 3 takeoffs and landings in your airplane within the last 90 days, and then it's time to carry passengers, and you have a 12-knot crosswind component. You are current, but are you really proficient in the circumstances that you are electing to fly in? So proficiency is only the first step. Striving for mastery of all tasks and command of your aircraft is what's going to make us safe. All right, command the airplane and you will be safe. I've got another slide, I'll get there in a second. And mastery command, I think, proactively enhances your flying experience. It gives you goals to aim for. When I was just a private pilot, well, not just, when I was a private pilot, I was an Air Force officer at the time in Missouri, and I shared a house with another officer from my squadron. And Mark was very interested in airplanes as well. He was an engineer, a brilliant guy, an extremely good Air Force officer, and I talked him into starting to fly with the instructor that had finished me up on my certificate. He went through in fairly quick fashion. He went through the initial phases of training, and he soloed in a Cessna 150. And I came back I was a Minuteman launch officer, so we'd go away for 24-hour alerts at various times. I came back from alert one day, and Mark was there and said, hey, when are you going to go fly again? He said, no, I'm not. I'm done. I said, what do you mean you're done? He said, I soloed the airplane. He said, I wanted to prove to myself that I could fly an airplane. Check that box, I'm done. I'll go do something else. And part of it, I think, was that, and I didn't have the skill at the time to really push him, but I think was that he felt there wasn't a whole lot more than that. I've learned how to fly an airplane. There's a syllabus to complete his private pilot check ride, but what happens after that? He didn't have any real goal other than saying, I wanted to see I could fly an airplane. Mastery and command are goals to strive for, and there's always something else we can work on. So we can develop our own plan to keep ourselves interested in flying and to proactively work on getting better all the time. Anyone here not a certificated pilot? Okay, we all have one of these. Okay, all right. All of us pilots have one of these. When we think of ourselves as being pilot of an airplane, we think of ourselves as a person that has a piece of plastic from the Federal Aviation Administration that says, I can fly an airplane. This is what we think of ourselves. When your passengers come on board, or when your family sees you go fly the airplane, or your coworkers know that you're out flying the airplane, this is how they envision you. You are captain of that aircraft. All right? This is what they think. They think that when you go get in a Cessna 172 or a Beech A36 Bonanza or a Piper or Seminole or whatever you fly, that you are exercising the skill, knowledge, and judgment just like the guy who flies the Qantas 747 from Los Angeles to Melbourne. That's what your passengers think of you. Guess what? We need to try to prove them right. The universal symbol of captain of an airplane, the universal symbol of captain of an airplane is that 4-stripe epaulet. And there's nothing official about this, but I like to think of those 4 stripes as 4 goals toward mastery and command of the aircraft. And we can use these goals as ways of trying to fill in our own knowledge and proficiency gaps. So think of your goal as being captain of that airplane, and this is how you can go about becoming captain. First, getting your certificate or your rating just qualifies you to wear the epaulet, no stripes. Now, I went through officer training school in the Air Force, and for the first 3 weeks, we wore blank shoulder boards. This was like the entry thing. So you've satisfied the initial qualification, and yes, you've proven yourself to be able to do a lot of things, but for your own personal development and to be captain of your airplane, think of getting past the check ride as simply being getting your foot in the door. You've got a blank shoulder board. The first stripe might be thought of as mastering the airplane and its technology. You know how to fly a 172 because that's what you learn to fly in. Now you get into a 182 or a Bonanza or whatever you fly. You may have an insurance requirement, and there may be a complex endorsement or a high performance endorsement involved, but basically you don't have to go prove your ability to fly that airplane to the same standards that you flew that 172. But I suggest that maybe you should. Find somebody who knows that airplane well as an instructor and learn from them. You know how to fly, now you need to learn how to fly whatever airplane you've got. Secondly, mastering the technology. 15 years ago, I would have given a presentation like this and I would have just said mastering the aircraft. The reality is now we have just as important a requirement to master the technology in whatever airplane we fly. And when you go from one airplane to another, that technology changes. So you might feel like, hey, I am qualified as a private instrument pilot, but in this particular airplane, I'm not really qualified to fly IFR because I'm not really familiar with the avionics in that one. I'm in a unique situation because I do primarily flight instruction in airplanes that are extremely well equipped, but no 2 Bonanzas or Barons that I fly are alike. I could have a Garmin 530W in an airplane, but depending on the autopilot, I have 3 or 5 different steps I have to do to set up an approach. It's different in different airplanes. So one of your objectives is to master the airplane. Can you fly the airplane could you pass a private pilot check ride or a commercial pilot check ride or an IFR check ride today in that airplane? And could you pass an IFR check ride or even a VFR check ride in the airplane with the avionics it has on board? And if the answer is no, then you know what to do. It's time to start studying a little bit, practicing a little bit, and if you need to, get some dual instruction. If you have a flight review coming up, go to your instructor and say, hey, I've got my flight review coming up. I'd really like to work on this in addition to whatever you want me to do this time. So master the airplane and its technology. The second stripe is mastering the environment, the ATC environment primarily, or the airspace. It may not be controlled, but the airspace and the weather. 2 big things. We'll talk a little bit more about these a little bit later on, but if you have gaps in your weather knowledge, know now it's time to fix that. You may limit yourself to VFR only. You might be certificated only for VFR or rated only for VFR operations. That's good. You need to learn about weather too. And if you don't have a real good foundation in that, that's what you might talk about. Ask your flight instructor when you're getting ready to do a flight review, hey, can we spend a little bit of our 1 hour on the ground or a little bit more talking about how you, the instructor, evaluate weather, and I can learn from you. So that's the second stripe. The third stripe is mastering human factors and situational awareness. There's one of those keywords again, situational awareness, which is knowing what's going on all around you. We have a great deal of equipment on board our airplanes these days that allow us the opportunity to see what's going on. We've got uploads for weather, we've got ADS-B uploads, we've got all sorts of relatively inexpensive ways to see the environment. But we also have some pitfalls there. We are very used now to being able to program something into a GPS and see a magenta line, and we can follow that magenta line. This is something I do with people when I train with them. I'll have them dial in someplace that's 90 miles, 100 miles away. they head down that way, and I will ask them, all right, where are you right now? And I usually get an answer like, I'm 74.2 miles from the Salina VOR. I said, yeah, but where are you right now? If that GPS went out, or if you had to go down somewhere right now, where would you tell ATC you are? So what's going on? So get used to, part of your responsibility is to be able to see where you are in the airspace system. And then, again, we're going to talk a little bit about weather uplinks in a moment, but that's another big factor. If you've got this great uplink, well, here's an example. A gentleman I work with, Whit Hickman, at ABS, earned his private pilot certificate last November. He bought a Stratus, and I went and flew with him recently, and okay, I've got all this great weather data uplink. All right, well, how do you use that? Well, I don't know. I just don't go over that. Well, you know, what is this really meaning over here? And how do you find? Oh, hey, I can find the winds here and things like that. So learn how to use it. The fourth stripe is the most difficult to get across, is responsibility and command. We all know that we are, as pilots, ultimately responsible for determining the airworthiness of the airplane before flight. If you own or operate an airplane, you are the one who's responsible to make sure that the AD is current, or the ADs are all current, the annual is current, all the inspections are current. Sure, your mechanic does that for you for a fee, but it's your job to know all of these things. All right, so that's part of your responsibility. Command is a very difficult skill, again, to get across. Here's an example of a command statement. There was a beach bonanza. Just happens to be a bonanza because I study those a lot. It was flying over Florida. The pilot was VFR. He's instrument rated and current. He happens to be flying VFR that day atop a scattered broken layer. He's bombing along at about 5,500 feet. And all of a sudden, a little bit of oil starts to trickle on his windscreen. He has an oil leak. Well, he's participating in flight following services, so he keys the microphone and talks to, I think he was talking to Daytona Approach at that point. Tells Daytona Approach that, hey, I've got an engine problem. I need to get a clearance to land at the nearest airport. All right, so at the point he made that call to ATC, he was approximately 11 miles to the southwest of the Palm Coast Airport, which is eventually where he aimed to go. 11 miles to the southwest. So the controllers look at the situation real fast. There is an ILS approach that goes to a runway that goes approximately 330 degrees to the northwest. So here's the runway and the approach to the runway. He's over here from the airport. So what do? Controllers are trying to be your friend, right? And I mean it. They're trying to help this guy out. So what's the easiest thing for us as a pilot to fly in an emergency situation from a controller standpoint? What do you think they did to this person? They want you to fly a long, straight-in approach, right? Because that's the easiest thing for us to do. So in their mind, they were doing everything right. Let's make a long, straight-in approach. So he's down here, airport's up here. What do? Turn right heading 120 degrees. And he turns right heading 120 degrees. And they're sending him out here to intercept, and later they told him they're aiming for a 7 mile straight in. They're putting him way out here, right? So he's headed this way. The oil continues to stream up the windscreen a little bit. And they're vectoring him around, and I'm sure the pilot is thinking, whew, these guys are taking care of me now. All right, so he's at 5,500 feet. We're talking about an airport that is essentially at sea level, so the approach intercept altitude is going to be somewhere around 2,500 feet. All right, so he's out here going away from the airport to line up on the approach. What's the next thing you think the controller told him to do? Because they're trying to be easy on him. Hey, descend and maintain 2,500 feet. So he starts on down to 2,500 feet. And they keep sending him around on vectors, and finally they say, okay, you are 7 miles from the airport, you're cleared to land, and he goes inbound. 2 miles short of the runway, the engine completely seizes, the engine quits, the plane descends into a house, and it was a very tragic outcome for everybody. Right. The pilot was doing exactly what the controller told him to do, and I believe the controller was doing exactly what he thought was the right thing to do. I've actually talked to the NTSB about this because through my work I know some folks on the National Transportation Safety Board that maybe we need to revisit what is or is not the right thing to do in the case of a partial power loss in a single-engine airplane. Maybe, but instead of that, what might the pilot have done had he been fully in command of the situation? What? I want to go direct to the airport. Okay, Bonanza 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you turn right heading 050 degrees, we're vectoring you direct to the airport. And if he came up and he said, descend and main 2,500 feet, what might you say? Unable. I'm going to stay at 5,500 until I'm directly over the airport, and then I'm going to circle down. There was something in the neighborhood of a 1,500 to 2,000 foot ceiling. Under that scattered to broken layer, he might have been able to see the airport even through the breaks in the clouds when he got over it. That's the difference between flying an airplane and commanding the aircraft. Does that make sense? All right, some other examples of things you can do about this. Know your limitations. Your airplane is an extremely capable machine. You are an extremely capable certificated pilot, and we have a very, very good way of finding what the weather is doing in the modern cockpit. But every one of those has some limitations. So let's look at them. If we stay within our limitations, we're going to be great. When you go outside of them, that's when there's a problem. The program just before mine, I believe, was discussing this very issue. It's called the normalization of risk. Was anyone in here for the previous program? Pretty good program, was it? I was unable to come to that. Very briefly, what's the normalization of risk?
We get used to bending the rules, so we just keep on bending the rules, and suddenly it's toast.
Perfect summation. We bend the rules, and then we keep bending the rules until we go too far. And I don't think somebody who flies VFR into IMC, or somebody who penetrates a thunderstorm, or somebody who runs out of gas in their airplane necessarily meant to push it that far. The problem was that one day they were planning to make a VFR flight, and there was a 2,000 foot ceiling and 10-mile visibility. And they look at the chart and they decide, okay, I can safely get from here to there under visual flight rules, and so they go. But they're really nervous about it. I've never flown when the conditions are this low. So they take off and they fly and they land on the other end. Guess what? Hey, that worked. That wasn't nearly as bad as I thought it was going to be. Next time conditions are like that, they're going to say, got it, no problem. Except maybe next time it's only a 1,800 foot overcast and 5 miles visibility. So I try it with some confidence, and it works. And now I've got negative reinforcement going on here. I'm doing something that is getting progressively riskier, but because I'm going into it a little bit at a time, it doesn't seem as bad. And pretty soon they're doing things that, had it been the first time they ever tried to do this trip at 1,200 overcast and 3 miles visibility and stay down in the Class G and go ahead and do it, if that had been the first time they'd ever tried to do something like this, they'd say, there's no way I'm going to do this. But because it's worked out in the past, they feel a little more comfortable with it. So that's where I come back to maintaining your limitations. Use those as a no-go item. In my work at the American Bonanza Society, a lot of times people ask, we ought to have some sort of standard operating procedures manual for pilots. Well, I'll tell you, we already have one. They're called the Federal Air Regulations and the Airplane Limitations. Now, you may elect to make things even more restrictive than that on you, and in some cases that's a good idea, but that's the bare minimum we're allowed to get away with. And if you're not current on IFR, don't fly IFR. If you are required to plan to have at least 45 minutes of fuel on board the aircraft, plus what it takes to an alternate, and and then another 45 minutes of fuel on board, that's what you go with. And in flight, be watching your fuel level, and if it's going to be less than that, sure, you can legally do it, but let's adhere to that minimum. Don't let yourself talk yourself into gradually getting riskier and riskier and riskier. So let's look at some things about an airplane. Know what your airplane is and what is it isn't. Many of our airplanes have extraordinary equipment. I fly a lot of stuff that looks like that. Who flies airplanes that have some sort of combination of something that looks like that? Many of them have a great deal of information on board of them. And maybe even if you just have an iPad, there's a great deal of information. It looks like an airliner, but it isn't. What you have is a recreational or business tool. It is not a commercial aircraft. It's not certificated to the same standards. This equipment's not certificated to the same level as an airliner. Very frequently, you don't have the performance or the redundancy of an airliner. So it looks very, very capable, and it is, as long as you stay within its limitations. Flying can be very safe and very capable if you fly within the airplane's limitations. Now, and evaluate the weather. Weather is the most common reason for airline delays and cancellations. Well, I don't know where you are on the whole privatization thing. I could probably guess where most of you are, but notice that a big reason for privatization, one of the big substantiations put forth by the government is, well, that's going to improve the scheduling on airlines. And the reality is, airline schedules, when they are delayed, are almost always related to either weather or runway capacity because the airlines tried to schedule too many flights at the same time, or crew rest, the crew rest usually being driven by the weather or the runway capacity. So regardless, don't want to get too political here, but weather is the most common reason that the airlines are delayed. Your airplane's less capable, therefore, it's a pretty good chance that you are going to be subjected to delays, cancellations, and diversions as well. It's really not a matter of when you're going to have a weather delay, or if you're going to have a weather delay, but when. And just accept the fact that you're going to have to be flexible with the weather. If you stay within the limitations established in good practice for weather, all right, you adhere to VFR or IFR minimums as applicable, unless you set higher minimums for yourself, which is a good idea, and then you actually stick to them. As long as you stay away from thunderstorm activity, for instance, most of us probably have some way of getting weather radar information in the cockpit. Does everybody pretty much have, even from an iPad or an iPhone or something, some way of getting weather information? By the way, it's tomorrow morning. Look at the schedule out there. Dr. David Strawley is speaking in here. Dave is really the father of weather data uplinks. He was one of the persons that developed the system, the philosophy and the system to give us weather. Not only is he phenomenally experienced and knowledgeable, but he is an excellent speaker. So if you have an opportunity to come listen to Dave tomorrow morning, for those of you in ABS, he's coming to our convention in September also. But in any event, it's not if, it's when you're going to have some delays. All right, that weather data, that's what I was talking about. The weather data uplink there. When weather uplinks to the cockpit became widely available, there was an assumption that would improve the safety record, the lack of accident record, for flight into adverse weather conditions, primarily thunderstorm activity, but also other adverse conditions. The reality is that did not happen, and in fact, in some studies the NTSB and others have done, it looks as if the rate of weather-related accidents has gone up. Why might that have happened? Any ideas? Overconfidence. All right? I used to look out there and see a bunch of big buildups on the horizon, so I didn't fly there. Now I've got this, I can fly that way and maybe pick my way through this stuff. All right? What I tell people when I present classes on weather data uplinks and things is, this is a fabulous piece of equipment and can make you much more in command of your airplane if you use it correctly. But there's nothing about that little plot of greens and reds and yellows on your iPad that made your airplane any more capable of flying into a thunderstorm. It didn't affect the airplane, it just affected your ability to see it. What's the general rule of thumb for distance to stay away from a thunderstorm cell? 20 miles, all right? With this piece of equipment, it is much, much easier to find, to make sure you're at least 20 miles away. So you can be much more in command of the situation by saying, okay, I can see where it is. I'm not going to get within 20 miles of that in any direction away from my airplane. It's a lot easier to keep your 20-mile separation now than it used to be. And then you will realize the benefit, the significant benefit of weather data uplinks. All right? But anyhow, our airplanes, no matter what you're flying, whether you are VFR, IFR, whatever you're doing that day, our airplanes are very safe and they are very capable, but you have to realize the more you fly, the more you're going to have to make weather decisions. And so build that decision-making time and the delay time and everything into your flight planning. All right, then lastly, know what you are and what you are not. You're probably not an airline, an air carrier, or military pilot. Who is an airline pilot? I don't have a single one in here. That's amazing. Or a former airline pilot. How about military? Any military aviators here? All right. All right, great. You were a military pilot. That was great. Much of what you know, most of what you know as a general aviation pilot is directly applicable to flying an air carrier aircraft or a military aircraft. But not everything that's applicable to flying that military airplane or that air carrier is applicable to flying the general aviation airplane. It doesn't necessarily go the other way. Even if you are an air carrier pilot, an airline pilot, your experience does not fully prepare you for single pilot operation, especially in an IFR environment, but not necessarily. I taught, as Sam said when he introduced me, I taught at Flight Safety International for 4 years at Beach Field in Wichita. I taught Bonanzas and Barons. And we had a course where they would take ground school and simulator, and then we'd fly at the end of the week. So we spent 4 days in the simulator with these people. The only client I had in 4 years of teaching Barons and Bonanzas in that simulator that was not able to pass even a VFR-only completion was at the time a current U.S. Air Force KC-135 crew commander. Now, your Navy guys out there are going, oh, cool, yeah, Air Force. No, but it's the same thing. And the problem was that in that KC-135, which is a four-jet, it's very similar to air carrier airplanes also, he had a crew. Depending on the model of 135 he was in, he had between 3 and 5 additional cockpit crew members with him. If he lost an engine, you've got lots and lots and lots of power on the other ones, and there's a lot of automation involved in emergency operations. And I put him in a Baron where you've got thin margins on one engine. It's perfectly, you are capable of flying that airplane on one engine in most cases, but you've got to be right on your game. No one to help him out, and nothing automated at all about it. So even though he was a current KC-135 crew commander, he couldn't fly a Baron. We even gave him an extra 3 days, and he just couldn't pass the program, so he had to go do something else. So that doesn't fully prepare you for flying this airplane. Even if you are current as a military or an airline pilot, you are not getting the same level of you're probably not getting the same level of type-specific training and the same recurrent training in this airplane that you are in your day job. So you've got to scale it back a little bit. I've heard that, and I can't verify this, I've heard that one of the most common causes of death amongst airline pilots is a general aviation accident. And you do read about it a lot. Someone was commuting to work and they got in bad weather, or they got some time pressure to get where they're going. So this is not precisely like flying an airliner. If you're a retired airline pilot or a retired military guy, you're probably not as young as you used to be. I have a good friend who flies a Bonanza, of course. My wife says all my friends fly a Bonanza. I don't even have to say that. I have a friend. It's inferred that they fly a Bonanza. But I've got a friend who flies a Bonanza. He has some relatives on the West Coast. He lives in the central part of the United States. He likes to fly that airplane nonstop from California back to the Midwest. He likes to do it at night when there's not a lot of traffic. He likes to go really high, uses oxygen and everything. And he will routinely, not routinely so much anymore, but for many years he routinely did this like roughly 9-hour nonstop trip over the Rocky Mountains at night in a Bonanza with an oxygen tube up his nose. And I asked him one time, what is your risk management strategy for this trip? And his answer was, I used to fly 747s across the Pacific. And my response to that was, yeah, but that was 30 years ago. So realize that you are going to have to scale back a little bit as you get a little older. You don't necessarily have to go from doing everything to doing nothing. There's a transition time there. All right, but you're not as young as you used to be. So you, as a certificated pilot who is doing everything right, coming to safety seminars, getting some practice in your airplane, doing some instruction, more frequently even than necessarily required by the regulations, you can be very, very capable and safe in your airplane. But you can't do everything an airline crew can do, so don't pretend that you can. Don't think that you're going to be able to meet schedule all of the time, because that's not always going to be the case. You're going to have some things that you're going to have to work out sometimes. So stay within your limitations. The FARs and the pilot's operating handbooks are a minimum standard. That's the minimum safe operating practices. Don't violate any of that stuff. And the reality is you get away with a lot. I go to Australia occasionally. I've got some good friends down there. They're all flying people, of course, by definition, right? So they envy us. We complain, and apologies to the folks who are hosting us here today. They complain about all the restrictions and the regulations they feel are imposed upon us by the Federal Aviation Administration. We feel that we're restricted. The guys in Australia think we got it made, because the essential philosophy of the British-based regulatory system that the Australians are under is that if we tell you you can do it, you can do it, but you can't do anything else. Whereas under the Federal Aviation Administration, essentially it says, if you do all of this stuff, you can do anything else you want to do. So ours is an enabling system and theirs is a restrictive system. And actually the Australian government is in the process of changing their entire regulatory environment to emulate ours. But the idea there is these are the things we just absolutely can't do. I can't take off without my proper fuel. I can't take off unless I've done all of these things to make sure I'm current and proficient in the airplane. So no means no. Those are the limitations we need to stay within. And we have lots of roles as captain of our airplane. You're the pilot in command, you're the captain of your aircraft, but you are also the dispatcher. You're the person who has to figure out the cargo load and the fuel load and the weight and balance and the time and the amount of fuel it's going to take to get to your destination and what the weather conditions are like. You're the director of maintenance. As I said earlier, we are the responsible. The aircraft owner or operator is responsible for the maintenance status of the airplane. Not only the pre-flight inspection, but we are the ones who are responsible for determining that all of the inspections and all the required maintenance and repair are done correctly. I'll talk a little bit about maintenance and repair in a little bit at the end also, but that's our job. You're the flight surgeon. With Basic Med, even more so, we've always had the responsibility to self-certify ourselves before each individual flight, but with Basic Med, we have even more responsibility as the flight surgeon for our own little one-person flight operation. So, overall, personal use aviation can and is very safe, and the airplanes and our operations and ourselves are very capable, but flying, especially in a cross-country airplane, flying is almost another profession. It's like taking on a second job, and you've got to put some time and effort into it. If you don't like practice and you don't like reading, of course, you're in here, so either you like air conditioning or you like to learn about airplanes. One of those two things. But for people that you don't, people who are not necessarily in this group, but that you have contact with, encourage them to become the captain of their little one-person airline. All right, so limitations is one of the big factors of command and control of an airplane. Number 2, put time into training and practice. Your flight review requirement is not sufficient, to be real. If you were flying an Aranca Champ out of a grass strip and never went near a tower-controlled airport, never flew in anything other than really, really nice weather conditions, never loaded the airplane to its maximum gross weight, and you flew around recreationally, for the most part, getting an hour of flight instruction every 2 years is probably sufficient to do quality control on your operation. When you start to use your certificate authority beyond that very minimal level, really you've got a lot more work, I think, that you need to do to prove to yourself and to your passengers that you're in fact wearing the 4 stripes, you're captain of the airplane. You need to master 3 different things: airmanship, if you're an instrument-rated pilot, flight by reference to instruments, and the automation. Now, we had several people who were flight instructors here. One of my pet peeves, I suppose, is a pilot who comes to me and says, hey, I want to do an IPC, an instrument procedures check, and can we sign that off as my flight review also? I see that a lot in my world in the high-end owner-flown airplanes, especially because people are constantly putting the latest and greatest avionics in the airplane. So 2 years has elapsed. The guy's now he's got a Garmin 750 he's putting in the airplane. He said, what I'd really like to do is an IPC and get some practice with my Garmin 750. And then the next time, hey, I bought that new Garmin autopilot. I'm not pushing Garmin here today, but I bought that new autopilot. I've got that in the airplane. What I'd really like to do this time for my flight review is focus on the autopilot. I like to do that sort of thing, and I do it a lot, but I will not sign, personally, I will not sign anyone off for a flight review unless we do some stall recoveries, we do a few specialty takeoffs and landings, short field, soft field, crosswinds if at all possible, and most important for me, go-arounds. You'll see some things from in the media here fairly soon, I think, where the record shows that by far the greater number of stalls, loss of control in flight, occur not on the base to final turn like we think they do, but the vast majority of fatal stalls occur during a go-around. And so I make sure that even if I'm doing an IPC with somebody, we're going to do at least one go-around, so I make sure they know how to do that in their airplane. But so you might break it up a little bit. I'm going to do a flight review, and then I'm going to do an IPC on the odd year, and if at a minimum do something every other year. And if you have automation, this is something you need to, if you're not familiar with how that new piece of avionics works in your airplane, this is something you really need to do in addition to your normal flight review and instrument review process. So you've got 3 different tracks of proficiency going on here. Flying your airplane from point A to point B gives you a lot of time flying from point A to point B. But it doesn't give you an engine failure. It doesn't give you a diversion to point C. It doesn't expose you to a lot of things. Pilots think of themselves in terms of experience. During my introduction, I put down here for the paper for Sam that says, oh, I've got 4,600 hours of total time and 2,600 hours as an instructor. What I really should have done is, okay, I've survived 3 losses of attitude indicator in flight and 2 total engine failures and 1 partial engine failure in flight, because that's what I should be thinking about. How good am I? What have I experienced? My experience isn't a number. My experience is a set of conditions. So experience is what happens to you. What we need to do is train, and training it comes from learning what happens to other people. You're learning from their experiences. Now, put some time into training and practice. However, training does not need to be dual flight instruction. I'm not up here to make sure that flight instructors get more money. What I do suggest is that you make every flight you make have some sort of training benefit. I'm going to take off and go to the local pancake breakfast. There's no reason that I can't say, okay, today I'm going to do a short field takeoff and a short field landing, and on the way home I'm going to do a soft field takeoff and a soft field landing. I'm going to take off and land anyhow. I might as well practice it. When I started flying an A36 Bonanza that we have at the American Bonanza Society now, it had vertical nav functions on the GPS, and I remember the first time I went out to fly with it, I said, okay, my goal for this flight is to get to Olathe, Kansas, but I'm going to use the vertical nav modes. I'm going to learn how to do that while I make this trip. And if you don't have passengers along, even if you do, but really if you don't have passengers along, just because you're flying from here to there doesn't mean you can't do a steep turn on the way. So make every flight a training flight. You don't have to pay for any dual flight instruction. It costs nothing more because you're going to be up there anyhow. But practice those things that you had to demonstrate proficiency in order to become a pilot in the first place. Now, those of you that read my mastery flight training, this comes from that. One of the things I did one week was what I call the second stripe challenge. This is something I do for myself all of the time to retain my proficiency and to critique myself and know when I have to work harder on something. On a standard runway, if the markings are standard, One stripe is 120 feet long, and the space between stripes is 80 feet. So the combination of a stripe and a space, that's your profession, you know this stuff. The combination of a stripe and a space is about 200 feet. Now, if the runway isn't exactly the right length, the way they make it up is they make the spacing closer together in the middle of the runway. But at the ends of the runway, where it really counts, you've got about 200 feet involved in the combination of a stripe and a space. If you hold a private, recreational, or sport pilot certificate, or you have at one point held one of those, you demonstrated the ability on your practical test to land within 400 feet, minus 0 from an identified touchdown zone spot to plus 400 feet. That's only 2 runway stripes. It looks like a pretty small distance in this picture. But my second stripe challenge is every time I land an airplane, I'm going to try to touch down on the second stripe. Now, you can use the touchdown zone markers if you want. You know, whoops, going the wrong way, sorry. You can use the touchdown zone markers if you want and shift this whole thing up there, but use the distances. And if I land the airplane within that zone and I'm directionally aligned with the runway using the appropriate crosswind component and the runway stripe is between my main landing gear legs and I touch down smoothly without bouncing and all that, I do all that stuff, I am showing that I am just as good as I was the day I got my private check ride. You demonstrated the ability to fly to this level of precision at least once in your life, and I would hope at least twice, because your instructor signed you off for that check ride in the first place. But at least twice in your life you were able to do this, so there's no reason you can't do that now in the airplane you fly. If you find that you can't consistently touch down on the second stripe or no more than beyond one stripe beyond that, what's that tell you? Hey, I need to practice this a little bit, and if you can't get it worked out, I really ought to go fly with an instructor and see if I can get some tips to making this work. You can grade yourself every time you fly. You can do the same thing with steep turn stalls, whatever you do. Judge your skills against what you had to be able to prove you were able to do way back when you got your private pilot check ride. Now, if you fly to commercial pilot standards, that's plus or minus 0 plus 200 feet. That's one stripe and one space, and that's the same as the short field criteria for the private, recreational, and sport pilot certificates. Now, with the ACS, there are some changes now in the commercial, and it's a little fuzzy in some things, but think in terms of the old practical test standards. Aim for the second stripe. If you cannot consistently land smoothly in directional alignment with the runway and everything else on the second or third stripe, time to go get a little practice and get a little dual instruction if you need to. So challenge yourself to land on the second stripe and make up little challenges like this for everything else you do. Can I fly a steep turn and maintain plus or minus 200-foot altitude? Hey, I can do it within 75 feet. Cool. Let's make sure I keep it that good and maybe even get better at it. All right, another thing here, hand fly the airplane a lot. Who here has an aircraft with an autopilot? Okay. About 50-50. If you have an autopilot, you have 2 things you need to be able to do, not just one. If you don't have an autopilot, you need to demonstrate to yourself and occasionally to an instructor your ability to hand fly that airplane to a level of precision. Guess what? If you do have an autopilot, you have to do that, plus you need to demonstrate the ability to do everything the autopilot can do as well. A lot of folks talk to me about personal minimums, and I hear from a lot of people who will say, I have a personal minimum of 500 feet and 1 mile visibility for an ILS approach, and if it's going to be less than that, I'm going to use my autopilot. I think that's exactly backwards, because for those of you who have autopilots, at the beginning of a missed approach, you get down to minimums and you have to miss the approach. What's the first thing you have to do? Turn off the autopilot, because the autopilot will not fly that missed approach for you. So you have to be able to fly with a great deal of precision and proficiency very, very close to the ground. So what I suggest to people is if you have a personal minimum, then that counts whether or not the autopilot is operating. Don't let the autopilot take you anywhere that you can't go. Something I like to do to maintain my own, we'll get past that, to maintain my own proficiency is, assuming I'm in an airplane with an altitude pre-select autopilot, unless my workload is such that I'm busy doing something else that cannot possibly be delayed 2 minutes, which almost never happens, I hand fly my level offs. I don't let the autopilot do it for me. And what happens is, as you level off in an airplane, the pitch attitude required to maintain altitude will gradually decrease. If you're flying an airplane that has a big difference in speed from climb speed to cruise speed, you're going to see a fairly large change in the pitch attitude. In a Bonanza like I have depicted here, I'll be anywhere from 5 to 7 degrees nose up when I level off, and eventually it's kind of hard to see there. I'll end up at a slightly nose down pitch attitude in level flight, but it doesn't happen instantaneously. Meanwhile, your airplane's going to attempt to maintain the airspeed, really the angle of attack, but it's going to maintain the airspeed for which it's trimmed. And as the airplane accelerates, it's going to take progressively more and more trim down to hold altitude. But again, it's not instantaneous. You have to lower the nose, trim off the pressures, lower the nose a little more, trim off the pressures, lower the nose a little more, trim, 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 trim. And it takes a couple of minutes to get the airplane actually trimmed, maybe a minute to get the airplane fully trimmed. Guess what I'm doing during all of this time? Actively scanning the instruments, detecting any deviations from the performance I want, and making control inputs. So it's a gradual process, and it works very well, in my opinion, my experience, to help you maintain proficiency and command and mastery of the airplane as the airplane goes through a dynamic change in condition. And if you find that you can't precisely level off on altitudes, guess what? It's time to practice that sort of thing. You're not as good as you used to be when you got your private pilot check ride, so you have to work on it. All right, number 4, maintain mode awareness. All right, know what the avionics are doing. I'll go through this quickly in the interest of time here, but a very, very common situation I see is a pilot who is new to a piece of an avionics, or they haven't been using it to its fullest capability, and they get lost. And you ask yourself the question, what is it going to do next, or why is it doing what it's doing here? You need to be very, very fluent with the avionics, just like you need to be master of the aircraft. You need to master these as well. And it takes active cross-checking and monitoring. You don't just engage something and accept it. Good example of this is if you have a GPS with a moving map and you dial in you put in a flight plan. I always cross-check. I flip over to the page where I can see the heading and the distance to the first waypoint. Yes, it's really going in the right direction. And I always scale it out so I can see the entire trip I've got loaded in. So I say, yeah, it's actually going where I want it to go. There was it a Malaysian airplane that took off from Singapore recently, and they dialed in a waypoint. They put the wrong identifier in, and they ended up instead of landing in Australia, they ended up in Indonesia somewhere because they dialed in the wrong, and they didn't check it. They just blindly flew in the direction it told them to go. So check where you're going. All right. By the way, avionics and such, we say there's no new way. We've never invented no new ways to crash an airplane. This is really the new way to crash an airplane, is getting behind what the avionics are doing. All right. Follow a fuel plan. Who flies Cessna 172s? Who flies Cessna 150s? All right. Virtually everybody else has to switch left-right fuel tanks, or sometimes more fuel tanks than that. Without getting too much into it, there are approximately, I think the figure is still something in the neighborhood of 3 fuel-related engine failures a week in the United States. That may have relaxed a little bit with some good technology has helped in this case. But a lot of people run out of gas, or they run a tank completely dry and they can't get the airplane started up, get the engine started up on the other one. So follow a plan. Know what you're going to do. Have a rough idea of when you are going to change fuel tank selection, and have an idea of what the fuel tank level should be at various points along your flight, especially if you're planning a maximum endurance flight, whatever you're flying to the near the limit of what you can with whatever fuel you have on board the aircraft. So develop yourself a fuel plan, actually write it down, and then when you switch tanks, check your time. Yep, I got here when I was supposed to. Check your fuel flow. I'm using the amount of fuel I'm supposed to. The fuel gauges and the totalizer, or whatever you got, read what they're supposed to, and make certain that you know what the fuel state of your aircraft is. If you find that your ground speed is lower than you expected, start to calculate what your reserves are going to be, whether you do it with a whiz wheel or on your GPS or whatever, but actively monitor your fuel so you don't run out. Here's an interesting thing. Most fuel exhaustion events, when people run out of gas, most fuel exhaustion events happen within 10 miles of the intended destination airport. They almost make it, but they haven't been monitoring the fuel. They're probably kind of in a pucker there, like, I think I can make it, but they don't know. They're not in command of the airplane. All right, we're going to skip over all of that. Ways to check your fuel ahead of time, just because I'm getting a little wordy here. So, check all of the different ways. There are lots of different ways to check the fuel load on your airplane. You may have an aircraft where you can pull the cap and see fuel in there, even at a reduced fuel load. Cessna 150s and 172s are really good for that. You can dipstick them. In a low-wing airplane that has any dihedral, even a high wing with any dihedral to it, the fuel cap's going to have to be out on the far end of the fuel tanks. So if you have even a little reduction in fuel load, you might just be able to see the bottom of the fuel tank. You might not be able to visually check those airplanes. You might have a fuel totalizer, a piece of equipment that, assuming you put the right data in, will tell you how much fuel you have remaining in the aircraft and the rate you're using it. Cockpit fuel gauges are important. Look for any gross errors there. If you think the tank has been filled up or half filled and you turn on the switch before your pre-flight and it only comes up to a quarter tank, you have a discrepancy. Guess what? Check it out. Don't just assume, well, my gauge isn't working all that well, which is not really safe or legal anyhow. Check it out. Even some things like FBO fuel records are possible ways to cross-check. I flew a pair of Barons in Tennessee for a couple of years. Two of us flew those airplanes. We usually flew the same one. Each one of us flew the same one all the time. Sometimes we had to swap, and so we had a procedure where we were checking visual, if you could see it, a fuel gauge on top of the wing for partial loads if those airplanes had, the fuel totalizer. We wrote down a record of the Hobbs time and the amount of fuel we put in the airplane every time, and even fuel receipts. And our rule was, if any one of those indications differed from the others significantly, we had to put enough fuel in the airplane that we knew that we pumped in enough, or we could visually see that there was enough to make our trip. But any one of those, if any one of those was a discrepancy, we did something about it. All right. Get real about fatigue. This is something that is not very well studied in general aviation circles or aviation circles as a whole. I've been on some boards, some symposia with the NTSB and the FAA headquarters in Washington, and this comes up a lot in those sorts of discussions, that maybe we need to have some sort of fatigue guidance for flying our airplanes, but we really don't know what the problem is. There has been a great deal of accident-related fatigue study in the over-the-road trucking industry, and actually some groups like the National Business Aviation Administration or Association have developed some guidance that have a lot of basis in over-the-road trucking experience, when you figure it's someone getting tired operating a heavy piece of equipment, which in some ways describes an airplane. But it's one of the great unknowns in general aviation. Some people are morning people, some people are night people. I'm a morning person. I can get up at 4 in the morning and safely fly. I probably shouldn't plan on making a trip after about 7 in the evening, because I get tired at night. Maybe you're the other way, and you can choose when you're going to fly around that. I'm also, sometimes on a hot day, this time of day, I get a little bit tired. I go into siesta time. So that's a time for me to try to avoid a flight if I can possibly do that. We see a lot of mishaps that happen over the weekends. In some cases, I think somebody's worked a real hard week and they jump in the airplane and go. I mean, I tell you what, after working out here in the hot sun all week, I would not want to jump in the airplane Sunday evening and fly home. I'd wait till Monday morning and rest up myself. So there are lots of things to think about when you're evaluating your fatigue state. The most difficult evaluation to do is to evaluate, not only do you feel like you're okay right now, but what do you think you're going to be like after 3 hours of bouncing around in the turbulence, or if you're flying IFR, 3 hours in the clouds, or flying into night conditions? So you have to try to make an evidence-based decision on what you think you're going to be like, not now, but when you land where you're going. NBAA has come up with some recommendations on this. They do recommend no more than 10 flying hours in a day. Bear in mind they're talking about a crew environment in these recommendations, so that's 2 people. You've got someone to operate as quality control for you. Most of us don't fly 10 hours a day, but the other one's pretty interesting. The recommendation is no more than 14 hours in a duty day. Now, what's a duty day? It varies. It's flexible. What I think of as a duty day as a personal use pilot, alarm clock to engine shutdown. If I'm not going to have the engine shut down, including if I have to go to an alternate, if I'm not going to have the engine shut down before 14 hours after my alarm clock went off, I'm going to wait and fly the next day. So that's, I talked about how a lot of delays in the airline world are crew rest related. This is where you call a crew duty day on yourself and be firm about it and say, okay, I'm okay now, but we've got a 2.5-hour flight, and that's going to put me 35 minutes over my personal minimum. We're going to hang out here tonight and go in the morning. And these, again, assume a crew recommendation. In Part 91, private operations, there is only one duty day limitation that applies. What's the duty day limitation for Part 91 operation? Any flight instructors? What's the limitation? We're not permitted to provide more than 8 hours of dual flight instruction in any 24-hour period of time. That's the only limitation. So it's entirely up to you to make sure that you're not too fatigued to fly. All right. This, and then one more thing, and we'll wrap it up. Involve your family and your passengers in your decision making. I highly suspect that in a lot of cases where pilots feel pressured to get home despite the weather or fatigue or a maintenance issue with the airplane, I highly suspect that the greatest amount of pressure is perceived pressure that if I don't make this trip, somebody else is going to be mad at me. I'm not going to get home when I said I was going to get home. I'm not going to be able to make Jimmy's soccer game. I won't be available at work tomorrow, whatever the case. It isn't a real operational issue that presses people to go into the air when they shouldn't. It's a perception that somebody else is going to be upset if you don't get home. And so educate the people that are around you. Educate your family members. Tell them what sort of things you think about when you make a go, no-go decision. Hey, I've just established this 14-hour alarm clock to engine shutdown, and here's why I did it. And guess what? I'm doing this so that I don't get too tired in the airplane and I don't crash, and you don't want me to crash. It's very easy. I even have had students who have wanted to go on dual cross-country trips. It's very easy to look outside and say, hey, the weather's good here, and I called Grandma, and she says the weather's beautiful there. Non-pilots don't know what happens in between here and there. So educate them. These are the things that I'm concerned about. Oh, by the way, here's what I see on the weather radar. And I suspect in most cases your family's not going to say, well, try to get through there anyhow. They're going to say, okay, I agree, we're going to have to wait. Or maybe we'll fly up until we get to this point, and then we'll be able to get the rest of the way tomorrow. Educate your family and your passengers and even your coworkers about the reasons that you might have to delay or cancel a flight. Guide their expectations and involve them in the decisions. Now, you cannot delegate shrapnel. All right, you cannot delegate the go, no-go decision. However, you can say, here's what I'm thinking about. What do you think? Well, I don't know. Okay, you're right. We're not going to go because of this. Let them be part of the process. Or don't just say, we're not going to go. Tell them, we're not going to go because of this. So involve them in your decisions. All right. Lastly, to wrap it up here, maintain your airplane. Who owns an airplane? All right. Okay. As we said, you as the owner or operator of the aircraft are ultimately responsible for the status, the airworthiness of that aircraft. We maintain our airplanes. However, what most people call maintenance is really one of 3 very different things. The first is inspection. We're going to talk about each one of these in turn. The second is maintenance, and the third is repair. Inspection. Inspection is something you do to confirm the airworthiness of the airplane. When your mechanic signs off, when an IA signs off an annual inspection, they're signing that the airplane conforms with its type certificate, which is the list of stuff that it's supposed to have in order to be a legal airworthy airplane, or any supplemental type certificates, which are modifications of your airplane. So the process of inspection is to confirm the airplane's airworthiness and to confirm its conformity. It really does have 35 pounds of pressure in the nose tire, if that's what's appropriate. You're confirming that the airplane is, in fact, airworthy because it is what it's supposed to be. Okay? You're also detecting little minor squawks along the way, and you can address those. But an inspection can be an annual inspection, a 100-hour inspection, in some airplanes a 50-hour inspection. It could be a more detailed inspection when the airplane gets to 7,500 hours if you have an airplane that has a supplemental inspection document. And it is your pre-flight inspection every time you fly your airplane. What you're doing in your pre-flight inspection is confirming the airworthiness of that airplane. The second thing is maintenance. Now, airplane owners and everyone else, apologize my not really so much off-color anymore language, but has anyone ever said or felt like you have had the, quote, annual from hell? All right? What's the annual from hell? Expensive. Very, very, very expensive. Well, guess what? You have not had the annual from hell. The inspection just cost what the inspection cost. You had the maintenance and repair bill from hell because you weren't maintaining the airplane. Maintenance is what you do to maintain the airworthiness of the airplane, to prevent damage. You do it before something's broken, to prevent damage and to preserve the conformity of the airplane. You don't wait for annual inspection, and this is something really big in owner circles. People think that maintenance is something that happens at an annual inspection. Well, no, maintenance is something that happens throughout the year. You can spread that cost out. Repair, on the other hand, is what you do to restore the airworthiness of the airplane. You return it to conformity, you fix what's broken. Now, put it all into a nutshell, this is the philosophy of maintaining your airplane. The purpose of maintenance, changing the oil, checking the tire pressure, all those, the purpose of maintenance is to prevent the need for repair. Does that make sense? The purpose of inspection is to assure that your efforts at maintenance have been successful. Guess what? I've been changing the oil, and guess what? The engine seems to be working just fine. It looks good. If you have not maintained the airplane, you will eventually require repair, perhaps at the worst possible point, in what I refer to as darkest West Kansas. I talk to people, you're going into darkest West Kansas, and because you haven't overhauled those magnetos when you were supposed to, suddenly the engine won't work. So maintain your airplane because that's part of your responsibility as commander and captain of that aircraft. You must continually inspect the airplane, annual inspection, pre-flight inspections. You may be able to defer some maintenance, but not much. You cannot defer repairs. There are very specific things in the regulations that we can take off without. There are certain things in your pilot's operating handbook that you have to have in order to call the airplane airworthy. And you cannot defer those things. And where people have that, quote, annual from hell is where they've let things get worse and worse and worse. They've tried to defer repairs, trying to save money, and it only gets worse and costs them more in the long run. So wrapping this all up, I think we need to stop talking about safety. Safety is a negative to most people. And almost everybody, when you say, hey, are you a safe pilot? They're saying, yeah, of course. Why? I've not had an accident yet. We need to stop talking about safety. We need to stop teaching safety. What we need to teach and evaluate ourselves against is the concept of mastery of the airplane and controlling the airplane and command of the aviation environment. Okay, any questions? That was easy. All right, well, thank you very much. I appreciate you coming here. Enjoy the rest of the show.